searching for food under shelling.
When I stepped onto that street, what I saw was total apocalypse. A shattered balcony on the second floor. I still remember it collapsing completely.
Queues for water under gunfire.
Where could you get water? From makeshift springs. Well, Russia shelled those too.
Life without electricity, gas, or heat.
They hunted birds and rabbits, cooking over open fires.
Surviving without humanitarian aid.
11 people in Herske died of hunger. No food was brought to us at all.
Why the Russian army turns the absence of food and water into a tool of pressure. Watch in the special report, Hunger as a Weapon. Russia's deliberate tactics against the civilian population of Ukraine. Hunger, a medieval method of intimidation, breaking will, enslaving and destroying. In Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, the occupiers use it alongside the destruction of entire towns and cities. Around 5 million Ukrainians living near the front line face food shortages. These are data from the UN World Food Programme. More than half of Kherson region's population in southern Ukraine suffers from acute hunger. In Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions, 2 out of 5 people are starving. This is not just a consequence of war. It is deliberate, planned terror by the occupiers against civilians. And we will prove it. By early March 2022, Mariupol was under complete siege. The city endured constant shelling of residential buildings and critical infrastructure. At the time of the invasion, 446,000 people lived in the Mariupol territorial community.
On March 2nd, all electrical substations were hit. There was no way to repair them. Electricity went out. Once electricity was gone, water supply stopped. Heating stopped too because the pumps were not working. Gas pipelines were damaged, and within a few days, the gas simply ran out. We were thrown into a complete stone age. And at the same time, shelling continued by entire blocks. Aerial bombs, artillery, later naval artillery joined in. It was absolute horror.
The Russian army deliberately sabotaged civilian evacuation. Columns of civilian cars trying to escape on their own were mercilessly shelled. Russia blocked humanitarian aid deliveries by both Ukrainian and international organizations. On March 31st, a UN World Food Programme convoy was blocked. Later, the International Committee of the Red Cross was blocked as well. Left without basic means of survival, people were trapped in inhuman conditions. Russian occupiers deliberately forced residents out into the streets under non-stop shelling from all types of weapons.
On March 20th, Kadyrov fighters simply kicked us out of the apartment. At that moment, 2 wounded children and their mother were inside. Yehor Kravtsov, who kept a diary, was severely wounded. A chunk of flesh was torn from his back. The mother had a piece of flesh missing from her arm. Her leg was pierced through. Her daughter had a deep head wound down to the bone. They were in critical condition. Despite this, the Russian Kadyrov fighters forced us out and did not let us take even the most basic things.
They did not allow to take warm clothes or food, but Yevgen managed to grab his camera. As a professional photographer, he understood the importance of documenting everything happening around him.
What we had near the door was all we took. A bag with documents. My wife had prepared it in advance. My camera bag was there too. I went out to photograph when it was still possible. Inside were my photo archives. Luckily, along with the hard drives, a few pieces of clothing hung on a hook, and on a small shelf there was a thermos, a small thermos with water.
That is how their cold and hungry days began. In a basement under constant massive strikes by Russian artillery and aviation. In these conditions, they had to search for food. They had no supplies of their own.
When I went out onto that street, what I saw was total apocalypse. Everything destroyed. Buildings collapsed from the 9th floor down to the 1st, poles down, trees down, debris everywhere, craters from explosions. This was the central street of Mariupol. I was almost completely alone. Walking up Metallurgiv Avenue toward the city center, I did not meet a single person.
Hoping to find bread, Yevgen reached a local bakery near the central market.
Behind the broken doors, there were a few candies lying on the floor. I thought, at least I will take something for the children. It turned out there were only 2 candies. I thought, thank God, the kids will at least have sweets. It felt like a feast.
But this find almost cost Yevgen his life.
I picked up the candies and turned around. Gun barrels were pointed straight at me. Kadyrov fighters again. Among them was one Belarusian. I remember his patch. They shouted at me aggressively, telling me to come over and demanding to know what I was doing there. I tried to explain that we had wounded children and no food, that I was just looking for anything to eat. That did not stop them. They forced me to strip completely, searching for signs of body armor, tattoos, anything. They saw every man as an Azov fighter. They stopped men, stripped them, checked if they were military. I had no phone with me, luckily. They asked about it and then let me go.
Yevgen managed to find a bottle of stale water and some food left behind by people who had stayed in the same basement before them.
I found half a pack of butter there. Someone had left it behind. At that moment, it felt like a luxury. Outside, I noticed a shattered balcony on the 2nd floor. I still remember it collapsing completely. It looked like someone had stored walnuts there. I gathered them and brought them to the children. That became our first breakfast. I even have a photo of it. We gave the kids a walnut and a small spoon of butter. They ate. In normal times, of course, no one would eat like that. But in those conditions, there was simply no other choice.
Just like this girl in Yevgen's photograph, whom he met during another search.
I walked into this courtyard and saw an elderly woman. They had some bread left, drying it over a fire so it would not go to waste, turning it into rusk so it could still be eaten later. Next to her was this little girl. The grandmother gave her a piece of rusk. I really liked the girl. She was so bright and lively. I came up to her and asked if I could take her photo. She said yes, but she added, "I am not giving you my rusk."
One of the hardest questions of those days was what to feed the children. Attacks on grocery stores, markets, and humanitarian warehouses began from the first days of the invasion. The Mariupol Red Cross office was hit twice. Bank card payments were impossible. The city reverted to barter, like in ancient times.
People traded cars for baby formula. Mothers lost milk from stress. There was no baby food. Stores were later bombed, looted, burned.
There were cases when Russians clearly knew a food market had started operating, and immediately missiles or shells would hit it. People died, and the market would shut down.
Not only hunger but thirst killed people alongside Russian bombs and missiles. The city water utility stopped operating due to constant shelling. People searched for water sources themselves. They gathered in lines to collect water. Putin's army cynically exploited this.
There were spots around the city where you could get water, small springs, places people relied on. Russia shelled those too. People came there and had to drag bodies away. That was life then.
On March 6th, Doctors Without Borders staff in Mariupol called for an urgent restoration of water supply. The city council reported the death of a 6-year-old child from dehydration. The child's mother had been killed by shelling. People drank and cooked even with technical water taken from heating pipes.
I made coffee for myself every day. I will never forget that taste. I drained water from the heating system. It smelled of the chemicals added to the pipes. I boiled it over a fire several times.
People had to collect rainwater and melt snow.
For Mariupol residents, this was almost a celebration. There had been no water in the city since the 3rd. I took several photos of people gathering snow in pots and buckets, melting it to get at least some water to cook or drink. When the snow started melting, people scooped up that water.
Lawyers from the international human rights organization, Global Rights Compliance, filed a submission with the International Criminal Court. It states that the leadership of the Russian Federation deliberately created conditions in a Ukrainian city that led to hunger and the deaths of thousands of people. During the 85-day siege of Mariupol, Russia intentionally used starvation as a tactic to capture the city. The lawyers concluded that the Russian assault consisted of 4 stages. First, Russian forces attacked civilian infrastructure, cutting electricity, heating, and water. Second, people were denied humanitarian evacuation. Those who tried to leave were attacked. Third, the Russian army targeted critical infrastructure, shelled humanitarian aid distribution points, and places where drinking water was available. Fourth, strategic strikes were carried out to destroy or seize any remaining infrastructure. According to the lawyers, this demonstrates that Russia planned to seize a frontline city without any mercy toward Mariupol's civilian population. Members of the international organization place responsibility for the deaths of thousands of civilians on the highest leadership of the Russian Federation, holding them directly accountable, including Vladimir Putin personally.
Any actions deliberately carried out by the armed forces of the Russian Federation or by Russian political leaders with the aim of creating hunger or actions that knowingly lead to starvation of the civilian population constitute an international crime. These are not accidental consequences of war, but deliberate acts whose outcomes were clearly understood in advance. International law leaves no room for interpretation. The Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court strictly prohibit the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Civilians must be protected, and depriving them of food, water, or humanitarian assistance is forbidden under all circumstances. Article 8 of the Rome Statute directly states that the intentional creation of conditions leading to hunger among civilians is a grave war crime, carrying the most serious legal responsibility.
The occupiers used brutal methods of starvation in the now-occupied Luhansk region as well. Natalia and her son managed to escape from Lysychansk. The city was relentlessly shelled from the first days of the full-scale invasion. All routes for delivering humanitarian aid were cut off, but Natalia's parents, who lived in a private house, decided to stay.
Throughout those spring months, I begged them to leave. But they were adults, 65 to 70 years old, living in their own house. They had potatoes, some food, but the shelling was nonstop, endless. All routes in and out of the city were cut off from every direction.
In Lysychansk, shops stopped operating. Medicines disappeared. There was not enough fuel or drinking water. People were forced to live for weeks in basements or makeshift shelters, barely going outside due to the risk of shelling. As in Mariupol, the Russian army struck energy, gas, water, and food infrastructure in the Luhansk region.
Bakeries were burned first, always the bakeries. Shops were burned too. My mother went to get bread. People were standing in line, and then the shelling started. Everyone scattered. Some ran under staircases, some into basements, anywhere they could hide. It was all done deliberately, so people would be left with nothing at all. My parents stayed there the entire spring.
With each passing day, it became harder to find food. Supplies ran out quickly.
My father hunted birds and set traps. They caught birds and rabbits just to survive. There was no electricity by then. Gas lasted a little longer, but it disappeared too. No water, no power, no gas at all. In Lysychansk, every gas, water, and power substation was destroyed, so the only way to cook was over an open fire.
Families shared their last food. They ate dry rations, boiled water with leftover grains, or gathered whatever little could be found among the ruins. The elderly, the sick, and those unable to leave for help suffered the most.
11 people in Herske died of hunger. No food was brought to us. Whoever had something survived. People walked down the street, crying. A mother walked with 3 children. I told her, "Come here." I gave her flour. I gave what I had.
There were cases where elderly people died of hunger. There was nowhere to buy food. This was especially true that winter when the occupiers advanced. Businesses stopped operating. People were left with nothing. There were many such cases even in large cities because supply chains were disrupted.
This was not accidental. For those living in frontline areas of Luhansk and other regions, hunger was not a coincidence, but a brutal reality imposed by someone else's will. The Russian army used it as a tool of pressure, to force people from their homes, to break them, to subjugate them, and to destroy the most vulnerable.
This was carefully planned. Creating hunger in occupied settlements was beneficial for them. Why beneficial? Mariupol, Donetsk are obvious. But why Orekhovo, Gornyak, Chapaevka, Daryevka? Small villages with mostly elderly residents. They would have had to pay pensions, so it was easier to starve them than to spend money on them.
This is an act of extreme cruelty when civilians are not condemned to a quick death by weapons, but to a slow and agonizing one that stretches over days and weeks. It is carried out either to gain military advantage through sustained psychological pressure on Ukraine's armed forces and political leadership, or out of sheer hatred. It reflects a deliberate desire to destroy people simply because they are Ukrainian, because they refuse to submit to the cultural and geopolitical framework imposed by the Russian Federation.
Since the start of autumn this year, the Russian army has intensified strikes on energy infrastructure across Ukraine. The link between attacks on energy facilities and the risk of hunger is direct. Energy underpins nearly every sector, from food production to distribution. These strikes are not only massive, they are systematic, and the targets are not military.
The same actions directed against civilians, when they are large-scale and systematic and carried out not once but repeatedly over time, can be classified as crimes against humanity. These are offenses committed deliberately against the civilian population, without any military necessity or legitimate aim, and they constitute a fundamental violation of international humanitarian law. Such crimes are treated with the utmost severity, usually resulting in longer prison sentences, heavier fines, and other serious forms of legal and financial punishment. And if, within these actions, intent can be established to destroy a specific group of people, in this case Ukrainians as a group, and if it can be proven that this intent is not the result of isolated decisions by individual perpetrators but part of a centralized policy imposed from above, a consistent and recognizable pattern of conduct, then such actions may qualify as the crime of genocide under international law.
The conviction of Russia's leadership and those who carried out criminal orders for deliberately using hunger as a method of warfare against civilians must set an important precedent in international humanitarian law, lawyers emphasize.
The use of starvation as a method and means of warfare is a war crime. This has been prohibited worldwide for a very long time. For more than 100 years, starvation has been recognized as a method that cannot be used in war. And of course, it can and must be investigated as a separate category of crime. This is based on the fact that people in areas of active hostilities were often trapped in conditions where they had no access to humanitarian aid. They had no access to any humanitarian organizations on their territory, and most importantly, the key element is that objects essential to civilian survival were deliberately shelled. From bakeries to power stations. All that, taken together, can and does lead to a humanitarian catastrophe.
Hunger, in the arsenal of an army of sadists, killers, and looters, has become one of the most brutal and inhumane methods of capturing Ukrainian cities and villages. With cannibalistic cruelty, the Russian army, acting on orders from the Kremlin leader, deprives Ukrainians of any chance of survival, not only through shelling, but through the destruction of food supplies and the deliberate blocking of access to them. This Russian method, tested in Stalinist times, starving people into submission, is a war crime. And yet another proof that Putin is committing genocide in Ukraine. His goal is not territorial conquest, but the destruction of Ukrainians as a nation. Olga Mikhailyuk, Special Report.